Okay, we should be up and going. Thank you for coming. I am Jan Ozer. I'm the host of this webinar. This is the first one I've given on the GoToWebinar platform, so there are bound to be glitches. Some administrative details. I've got an over-ambitious agenda. It's going to be tough to get through, so it will be tough to take questions during the event, ask questions in the questions panel. If I don't get to them by the end, then I'll send you an email with the answers. And the webinar is scheduled to be 60 minutes. I want to honor people's time, but I'll be willing to spend a little bit more time after the webinar if you guys want to do that. If you're having any problems, send information in the questions. And just want to point out that you should be looking at on the right of your screen a handy dandy GoToWebinar application. And if you go to the handouts, you'll see firstwebinar.pdf. You can download that, and that contains the slides that I'm showing in this presentation. So here's the agenda: where codecs come from and what they cost, hardware versus software codecs, meet the codecs, existing MPEG 2020, and what are the new rules of codec introduction. Hang on one second, I'm going to turn off my heat. Sorry about that. Talking to you from very chilly Southwest Virginia. I had the heat turned up to get the place heated so I could go through and not freeze, and then I just had to shut it off. So that was that. Anyway, continuing with the agenda, we're going to look at how we analyze quality, talk about codec versus encoder, more specifically reference encoder versus a real-world encoder. Then we'll look at the difference between academic and real-world trials. Kind of a pet peeve for me, what BD rate doesn't tell you, and some alternatives to BD rate that I'm starting to use in articles and studies that I'm producing. Then we'll look at some performance results from LCEVC and VVC, and then we'll do a little bit of predicting when the latest crop of 2020 codecs from MPEG are going to be useful. So let's jump in. So where do codecs come from and what do they cost? And as you know, there's two sources, either standards-based or open source. Standard-based codecs are the ones we know and love, include MPEG 2, H.264, HEVC, VVC, EVC, and LCEVC. And these are created by committees that establish goals and targets. Multiple companies contribute, usually patented encoding tools that are rigorously tested for effectiveness and then either included or excluded. And it's a very formal process with multiple test iterations. How these studies are funded, or how these codecs are funded, is typically one or more patent pools. We will spend more time on patent pools in this next section. And companies are free to join or not join a patent pool. You'll see an example of that in the HEVC arena. But companies who contribute to standards are often forced to pledge to make their standard essential patents available either on a royalty-free or a fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory basis. And that's what FRANs mean, if you've seen the term FRAND around. Open source, some examples are Ogtheora ZIF. This is one of the first homegrown video codecs, VP8 WebM, Googlebot Onto, and then open source VP8 as WebM, and then later shipped VP9, also open source. And then AV1, kind of the mother of all open source codecs at this point. The Alliance for Open Media was formed in 2015, and it merged multiple open source projects like VP9, Thor from Cisco, Dala from ZIF, plus IP from Microsoft, Intel, and many other companies. How is this funded? By individual companies making profits from using the codec. And what's the IP policy? According to the AO Media documentation, the Alliance completed a comprehensive evaluation of the video codec patent landscape to avoid infringements. AV1 is free to use for all implementers. If you contribute technology or patents to AV1, you do not get a royalty on that. You also contribute those royalty-free. And as part of the formation process, AO Media started a patent defense fund to fund against any patent claims. So let's look at VP8. Is it royalty-free? So VP8 was purchased by Google from onto in February 2010, and it was open sourced in May 2010. And then in February 2011, MPEG-LA, who was a patent pool administrator, started a patent pool for VP8. They put out a call for patents, basically saying, hey, anybody out there whose patents are infringed by VP8. And in March 2013, Google signed a license agreement with MPEG-LA for techniques that may be essential to VP8 and earlier generations of VPX video compression technologies under patents owned by 11 companies. So they licensed technology that might be essential to VP8. And MPEG-LA closed the patent pool. The terms of the agreement were never disclosed. There was a strong assumption that substantial funds, royalties, changed hands. And that's a long way of saying Google has claimed open source in the past equals royalty free, but it looks like they ended up having to license technology to make that so. So just because someone claims technology is open source doesn't mean it's open source and royalty free. And you can read all about this in this bit.ly URL. So coming to VP9 and AV1, we've got two pools from Sysvel, and Sysvel under the current licensing arrangements are charging royalties for consumer devices only, not content. There is no annual cap. Every deal is done on a individual basis. And whether or not they're going to license software, in the browser is to be determined at this point. Patents in the pool, the VP9 pool has 765 patents in it. That's to date, more are coming. And the AV1 pool has 1461 to date, again, more are coming. And members include some pretty respectable companies, including Dolby, Ericsson, GE, Philips, NT, Docomo, Orange, and Toshiba. And full disclosure, I consult with Sysvel primarily on marketing matters. Wanted to mention that. So, patent pools, I think, have a negative implication, and I think they perform a critical function in the video space. I wanted to spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes talking about what they are, what they do, and the requirements that they have to exist. So this is a quick primer on patent pools. Now, courts frown on pooling of interest. If you've heard that term, it's a legal term, and it's an antitrust violation. And what we have with the patent pool is a pooling of interest. But the reason they're allowed is because they save a ton of administrative costs and they speed the dissemination of technology into the market. So on the left, we see no pool. So we've got 4 patent owners and 4 patent licensees, and outside of a pool, every patent owner would have to do an agreement with every other license owner to use their patents, and everyone trying to implement the technology would have to do a separate license with each patent owner. So there's a whole lot of licensing going on. Licensing takes time and it costs money, and we'll see examples of that in a moment. On the right, we've got one patent pool. So we've done the agreement inside of the patent pool. So each licensor has to sign one agreement with the patent pool to start to use the technology. There's a big but to all this. In order to make sure that there's no unfairness, the Department of Justice in the United States and the DOJ equivalents in other jurisdictions strongly suggest that pools evaluate each covered patent for essentiality to make sure it's essential to the technology that's covered. And this gets very expensive. So this is from a law journal article measuring costs and benefits of patent pools. And primarily, I just want to show you the cost of the due diligence involved. And here's a URL for the article. And this is data from the VIA MPEG audio pool. And what we see is they spent $5.25 million for patent evaluations. That was the third-party evaluation that I talked about. Patent evaluation fees, 700 patents at 7.5 grand per patent. And the total startup costs were around $7.8 million. Now, this is the total transaction cost. So we have all the patents in the pool here, and we have 805 licensees of those patents. Now, if each licensee had to go to each licensor for each patent and then negotiate a separate agreement, the authors estimated that that would have cost $636 million. Now, if you take the 636 million and you subtract the formation cost that we show over here, you've got a net transaction cost savings of around $628 million. So this is the administrative benefit that patent pools serve. So the key points: patent pools are subject to legal scrutiny. Third-party examiners are almost always used to analyze essentiality, because if you don't, you're subject to antitrust litigation. You just don't throw a patent pool together. It's a very expensive and a very time-consuming process. So does all this mean that AV1 and VP9 are not royalty-free? Absolutely not. Google and the Alliance for Open Media can argue that the patents are invalid, that the third-party examiners are wrong, but we've got 765 VP9 patents and 1461 AV1 patents with more coming to try and say aren't relevant or aren't valid patents. So it's a pretty steep hill to climb. But it does mean, and the main point of this section is, just because somebody says a technology is open source, it doesn't mean that it's royalty free. If Google wants to give it away, fine. But if they're infringing on somebody else's third-party IP rights, somebody's gonna have to pay a royalty. Okay, how are we doing time-wise? We're behind. Really quick blurb on hardware versus software codecs, because it's an important distinction to me in terms of how quickly codecs can get deployed in the market once they're in place. So software codecs can be played in software without performance issues or without significantly shortening a device's battery life. And if you're a software codec, you can be deployed immediately. Now, obviously, it's best if you're supported in a browser, because you don't have to do anything else but have that browser installed. But if you're a software codec that's not included in the browser, you can get a player to be compatible with your codec, which is a strategy that Bjontegaard did with Perseus. And as long as the producer who is using your codec uses that player, Theo player, Bitmovement player, JW player, anybody can view your videos. You don't need to be in Chrome. You can be in the player. But it may give rise to a royalty if you're using a standard-based technology. And then mobile devices, you can deploy a player in an app if it's not supported in the browser. Now, with software codecs, easy to decode software codecs, some smart TVs, OTT devices, and STBs can, you can write an app that will play them back, but that's going to be device dependent. On the other hand, if you're a hardware codec, you're too complex for real-time playback, and/or you'll overconsume battery life on devices, which basically means you can't be deployed until hardware decode is available. And typically that's a 2-year cycle after the standard finalization and royalty setting. So, AO Media launched AV1 in May or June of 2018, and we saw the first AV1 enabled smart TVs hitting the market in the beginning of 2020. So that's the 2-year cycle, 1 year to silicon, another year to consumer devices. So, and just because you've got a consumer device out there doesn't mean you've got a critical mass that's worth addressing. So the number of AV1 compatible smart TVs at this point is very small. So you've got to wait another couple of years until that market becomes big enough to really be worth the additional encoding costs to support that market. Okay, so that's software versus hardware. Now let's meet the codecs. We're going to look at the codecs you know and love, H.264, VP9, HEVC, and AV1. Then we're going to look at some new rules of codec deployment, and then we'll circle back to the MPEG codecs that were launched or pretty much announced in 2020, and that's VVC, EVC, and LCEVC. So here are the factors I consider when I'm evaluating codecs and their deployability. So this is H.264, it's standards based. There's a single patent pool from MPEG LA. There are royalties on paid content and subscription pay-per-view, small numbers, but they're numbers. There is no royalty on free internet video. There is a royalty on hardware encode decode. There is a royalty on software encode decode. And the max annual royalty, which I think is now this year, it started out at 5 million and kept increasing year by year. I think it's now at 9.75 million. And H.264 is a software codec that can play pretty much anywhere, although there is lots of hardware support on devices and TVs to minimize battery usage or power usage. HEVC is the next in line after H.264. It's also standard-based. Instead of one patent pool, we have 3 patent pools, and 2 of the patent pools have declared what they're doing on paid content. MPEG LA has no royalties at all on paid content. HEVC Advanced, now Access Advanced, has royalties only on physical media, and Velos hasn't, they don't announce their royalty policies. Their fact, however, says that they're still studying. The HEVC was put in place in, I think, 2013. Velos's fact says we're still studying to determine whether or not we want to use deploy content royalties. So hopefully at some point they'll wrap that up and decide one way or the other. There is royalty on hardware encode decode. There is royalty on software encode decode. Max annual known royalties for HEVC is 25 million for MPEG LA, 40 million for HEVC Advanced. I think it's up to 45 if you include content. And Velas Media, we just don't know. And HEVC is considered a hardware codec for most devices because it can overconsume battery life if you don't have a hardware HEVC decoder on that device. VP9 from Google, we talked about where it came from. There is a patent pool for that from Sysvel. We talked about that as well. It does not currently impose royalties on paid content. There's no royalties on free internet video. They're charging for consumer devices, and they're not currently charging royalties for software. And VP9 is pretty much considered a software-based codec, and it plays pretty efficiently on most supporting devices. It's supported in pretty much every Android device as well as every AOM browser. And then AV1, the Alliance for Open Media, is the owner of that. And again, we have the Sysvel pool, not currently charging on content or free internet video. Again, the royalties are focused on consumer devices, not encoders, not software. And every deal is done individually, but there are no caps. You negotiate your price based upon the expected volume. And AV1 is considered a software codec, although it is somewhat harder to decode than H.264 and VP9. So let's look at the new rules of codec deployment. And we're going to look at two: the impact of the HEVC royalty imbroglio. Always wanted to say imbroglio, and there we have it. And the impact of the Alliance for Open Media on the acceptance of standards in AOM companies. So here's the timeline of HEVC royalty releases. So it was first draft international spec in January 2013. About a year later, we had the first and what we thought was the only patent pool, which was from MPEG LA, and that's 20 cents a unit, $25 million a year cap, up from 9 million, and no content royalties. So that was cool. It came out 1 year. You know, we had royalty certainty, we thought, within a year after it was released. But then in July of 2015, HEVC Advanced came out, now Access Advanced, and they had a royalty. It was up to $1.50 a unit, no cap, and they wanted to charge content royalties of 0.005% of addressable revenue. They later added a cap. They later dropped the revenue for content, but that was a big deal. There was a lot of market outcry because of that, and that was 2.5 years after MPEG was first draft international spec, meaning you could start using it. And then in March of 2017, Velas came out with their patent pool, and they don't specify the terms, and they don't rule out, as I said, content royalties even to this day. So that's 4 years and 3 months after the standard was released. We have a totally new patent pool, which really irritated a lot of people who might otherwise have used the technology. And this was a picture created by a gentleman named Jonathan Samuelson of Davidion. Now he's with Apple. And this is patent ownership as of 2017. It's changed, but it shows, 3 different patent pools plus a bunch of big companies who weren't in any patent pool. And that made for a really, really scary landscape if you were going to implement HEVC, because you didn't know how much you'd pay. You didn't know who you'd pay it to. You didn't know which of these companies would be charging and which wouldn't. So, that caused a delay in the adoption of future standard-based technologies. So with MPEG-2, H.264, and HEVC, a lot of companies started engineering these new specs into their products before the royalty policy was known, because they figured it would be reasonable. And this is, I'll show you a URL for this article at the end of it, but this is David Ronca, who was then director of video for Netflix, now director of video encoding at Facebook, talking to Thierry Fautier, who's with Harmonic, and he's with the MCIF that you'll learn about in a moment. And Ronca's comment was, I built one of the first HEVC streaming platforms, and I got burned because of the royalty policy. The trust was broken. Get the royalty terms out in clear and unambiguous language, and then we'll decide if the codec makes sense. So post HEVC, I think you're going to see a lot fewer companies start to adopt the technology before the royalty policy is known, and obviously this is going to delay integrations. And here's another point made by Ronca. Don't be surprised if there are a few companies willing to jump on the deployer codec now and trust us for fair and clear royalty terms. Train. We did that in 2004. It didn't go so well. Excuse me. And here's the promised URL to the article. So basically, the royalties that were, royalty policy from HEVC, all the patent pools that came out, really soured the market on quickly adopting new technologies like you saw with MPEG-2, H.264 and AV1. And now we have the impact on the Alliance for Open Media and AV1 on future standard acceptance and usage. So the prominent members of the Alliance for Open Media include Apple, Microsoft, Google. In the device sector, you've got Apple, Google, Samsung, and Amazon components, Intel, NVIDIA, ARM, and Idiom. And content, you've got YouTube, Netflix, Amazon, Facebook, and Hulu. And then infrastructure, Bitmovement, Atem, and AWS Elemental. So AO Media companies, they control desktop OS, they control mobile OS, they control browsers, they control components, they dominate content, they dominate other viewing platforms. You got Samsung and TVs and Android tablets and phones, and they also control infrastructure adoption, how quickly companies who want to use codecs can get encoding services from companies like AWS Elemental, Atem, and Bitmovement. So, we see that AOM members won't support HEVC even when it's free. Browsers can usually support a codec if it's supported by the operating system without incurring an additional royalty. That's initially how Firefox supported H.264 on mobile platforms. So in theory, Google and Mozilla could support HEVC on any platform that includes HEVC support, which includes, the Macintosh, most new Macintoshes, most new iPhones, most new Android phones, and many Windows PCs. They could do it for free without leveraging OS support, but they haven't. And this really complicates usage for people, people who want to use HEVC and play it back in a browser. And because royalties are likely not involved, because you're going to leverage the HEVC decode that's in the operating system, you don't have to pay an additional royalty. Because royalties aren't involved, it's more of a strategic decision to try and damper usage of the HEVC codec and future MPEG standards than a financial decision. And here's where we're seeing it play out. So this is from a website called Can I Use, and this shows where technologies can be used in the browser. And this is HEVC. So the brown is from Can I Use, the blue is from StatCounter. I just wanted some measure of browser market share as a backstop to these numbers. This 63 is all Chrome versions, so these numbers are not going to reconcile, but again, I just wanted some sense of it. So browser support for HEVC was finalized in 2013, and it's got a whopping 19.18 playability in all browsers that support HTML5. And if we looked at H.264, we'd see that number is around 98%. So it's not supported in Chrome, Firefox, Edge, and Samsung, and they are all Alliance for Open Media members. It is supported by Apple, but Apple joined the Alliance for Open Media after they decided to support HEVC. And then this is AV1, and it was finalized 5 years later, and we see 33%, almost twice as much browser support, primarily because it's supported in Edge, Firefox, and Chrome. Not supported in the Apple OS yet, but probably going to be coming because it seems that Apple has supported VP9 after all these years because they wanted to play 4K videos from YouTube. And it's not yet supported in the browser on some of these mobile platforms, but a lot of the AO Media companies are using their apps to play back AV1 encoded video on Android and iOS tablets. The bottom line is AO Media members can slow or block the deployment of standard-based codecs in a lot of different regions. And lack of browser support is a very big deal for, if people are primarily playing your video in the browser and you don't have browser support for your codec, you can't practically use it. Less so for OTT shops. I mean, Netflix has enough people watching on a living room TV that they don't, that it makes encoding in HEVC affordable. But if you were, again, if you're distributing primarily to computers, then lack of browser support is critical. There are workarounds, as I mentioned before, but that may trigger a royalty obligation. And on hardware, if you've got a hardware codec, the lack of hardware support, looking at all the infrastructure companies that are in the Alliance for Open Media, if they decide, hey, we're not going to deploy VVC on this year's chip or on this year's GPU, then you're not going to get in that year's devices. So AO Media is a tremendous force that really, I think, is going to do a lot to slow the market acceptance of standard-based codecs. Okay, so that's kind of the new rules. Now let's look at Now let's look at MPEG Codecs 2020. Let's look at the overview and goals of those codecs, and then look at the 3 codecs, VVC, EVC, and LCEVC. So MPEG is the motion pictures experts groups, assuming you're kind of new to this space, and it's a standards body that created MPEG-2. Along with the ITU, it's responsible for H.264 AVC, H.265 HEVC. Now, for perspective, there was a 10-year gap between MPEG-2 H.264 and H.264 and HEVC. And now we're seeing 3 codecs being launched by MPEG within 1 or 2 years. And there was 3 motivations to accelerate these new standards. One was the HEVC royalty disaster, which we covered. The other one was the AV1 codec, which is a pretty alluring alternative, even if it might be royalty bearing. And the third was encoding complexity, which again, a very relevant post from David Ronca, where he talked about encoder complexity is hitting a wall. We really needed codecs to be less complex, easier to encode on meaningful platforms. So MPEG needed a rational royalty policy. They needed technologies to compete with AV1, and they needed a CPU efficient alternative. And to meet these 3 goals, they had to launch 3 new codecs. So here's versatile video coding, and this is what I call the typical MPEG codec. This is the one that's been in development for years and years. The other 2 were kind of fast-tracked. This one was on the 8 to 10-year cycle that we saw for MPEG-2 and H.264. It was finalized in July 2020. The quality target is between 30 and 50% more efficient than HEVC. We see in this particular results model, we see it achieving 37% better, and we're going to look at my results at the end of the session, and we're going to see it did even better than that. In terms of encoding complexity, the target was 10x HEVC encode, and here we're seeing 8.9, and decode complexity, it's 1.6 shown here, and we'll look at my results again at the end. What about the royalty situation? A forum called the Media Coding Industry Forum was created to try and make sure that VVCs came out with a rational royalty policy. Now, one of the things that they did was allow the technology to register sub-profiles that can exclude specific tools from recalcitrant vendors. So if a vendor doesn't want to license their technology for a reasonable price, they can be pulled out of the spec. And that's great because it gives you a lot more flexibility on the IP side, but you really don't know what you're looking at from a performance perspective, because if key tools are removed, the effectiveness that we're projecting may change significantly. And the MCIF also agreed to patent fostering with most of the VVC patent owners. And what patent pool fostering does is try to promote the formation of a single pool with as many owners as possible and come out with a reasonable, rational royalty policy as quickly as possible. So they initially launched that in the September-October timeframe. They were they narrowed it down to 4 patent pool administrators. They were interviewing them last month, and hopefully they'll soon make a decision as to which patent pool administrator they'll go with. And the problem with that is the technology was launched in July 2020. Once you select a patent pool administrator, they've got to start the due diligence process I talked about. They got to start the pricing negotiations between the different companies involved, and that could easily push things through, certainly the end of next year before we understand what the royalty policy is going to look like. And according to the new rule of technology development, few companies are going to start developing with VVC until that royalty policy is known. Okay, so VVC summary, the ability to exclude technologies based on profiles may speed the licensing process, but it limits our ability to predict how VVC will perform. The licensing process is uncertain, though the patent owners agreed to the patent pool fostering. HEVC Advanced, now Access Advanced, has already proposed their own joint HEVC-VVC pool. So they're trying to dominate the pool space and kind of go around the patent pool fostering that MCIF tried to enforce. And you can read about that here. And those some disagree. I think VVC is a hardware codec. You'll see that in the test that I performed at the end of the webinar, which means it's going to take at least 2 years before a consumer level product appears. And that's 2 years after the later of either the, the FDIS, which was July this year, or the announcement of the royalty policy. And then, even once you have device one with VBC hardware decode available, it's going to take another 2 to 3 years before that market becomes big enough to really start focusing on creating a separate set of encodes just for VBC. So what does the VBC do to accomplish MPEG's goals? Hopefully MCIF can herd the cats and bring us a rational royalty policy in a short time period. Doesn't do anything to compete against AV1, and it doesn't do anything to reduce complexity. So here's essential video coding, EVC. This is the second of the two MPEG codecs that were, came to prominence in 2019, 2020. And VBC or EVC has two profiles. One is baseline, that's royalty free. It's using technology that all is over 21 years old. Now, when I say royalty free, it goes back to the open source discussion we had a few moments ago. Just because the goal is to make it royalty free doesn't mean they're not infringing on somebody's patent rights, but the goal is to make it royalty free. The main is going to be royalty bearing, and that's controlled by 3 companies. In terms of performance, the baseline version, so this is the free version, compared to H.264 is 31% more efficient. The main version compared to HEVC is about 27% more efficient than HEVC. In terms of encode decode complexity, the baseline version is 42% harder to encode than, again, H.264, and on the decode side, it's 116% more CPU cycles required. For the main, it's 4.5x hardware encode, 1.54x decode. So this is, again, looking to be a hardware codec. And there's some later results here if you're interested in EVC. EVC, maybe they'll come out and announce first draft international spec and tons of support for it, but it really just seemed to go away. I haven't heard a lot about it, but there are these results from a recent meeting in October 2020. So what about the licensing policy? EVC uses a novel profile structure, again, the 20-year-old technology that they're hoping will be royalty free. And they also have the ability to pull tools from the main profile if they can't get the IP rights that they want at a reasonable price. Should not be a problem for EVC because most of the IP is coming from 3 companies, and presumably they want to get the technology out there as quickly as possible. The big problem with this slide, and you can download the entire presentation at this bit.ly URL, is that the goal is to publish the royalty policies within 2 years of the first draft of international specification. We haven't had that yet. So it's kind of funny. It feels like timely publication is an oxymoron to 2 years of the FDIS stage. I mean, we saw with MPEG-LA and at the HEVC patent pool that all the companies in that pool were able to pull it together within 12 months after FDIS for HEVC. Given the new rules of technology deployment, it would be great if EVC and the owners of the IP for EVC could push out the royalty policy much more quickly than 2 years. So what does EVC do to accomplish MPEG's goals? In terms of rational royalty policy, because you can pull technology out and because there's a limited group of companies involved, it should really promote the rational royalty policy, although the 2-year goal just seems kind of scary. It can compete against AV1 because you've got a royalty-free baseline profile that's 30% more efficient than H.264. I mean, that's pretty snappy. And it does reduce complexity somewhat in the baseline version, but not so much in the main version. And that takes us to low complexity enhancement video coding. And this is the standardization of the vNovo Perseus technology. And basically what you have is a 2-level encode. You've got a base layer and then an enhancement layer. And the base layer can be any existing codec. It could be H.264, it can be HEVC, it can be AV1, it can be any existing codec. And the enhancement layer is on top of that, and that adds resolution and quality. And the good thing about using a base layer codec is if you send LCEVC encoded video to a smartphone that doesn't know what LCEVC is, it will still play the H.264 video. So it's backwards compatible to any platform that plays the base video codec. We'll show performance later in the session. One company, Vinova, controls the IP, so the royalty structure should be pretty simple. And we're going to look at that in the next slide. When is LCEVC going to be relevant? Well, it's shipping today as Vinova technology, so it's instantly usable. The only one of the three MPEG codecs launched in 2020 that are. So here's the royalty status. This is first time that's ever been disclosed. So when LCEVC software libraries and licensing model are already available to potential licensors. So Vinova hasn't announced it, but they're making it available to people who are looking at the technology to license it. And if you're one of those people, you can contact Vinova for more details. LCEVC can be immediately deployed from a licensing perspective. What is a licensing model? They've got separate licensing models for different verticals. In the video entertainment realm, they offer their LCEVC SDK with a royalty, which are low and cap fees for video entertainment services who are actually delivering video to end users. So they're putting a royalty on the content for the people who actually get the benefit of the reduced bandwidth and the higher quality of experience that LCEVC delivers. And licenses are royalty-free for ecosystem enablers like browsers, operating system, and device drivers who enable playback of the content. So that's pretty different than anything that we've seen from any of the other technologies. So how does LCEVC accomplish MPEG's goals? It's a single IP owner. They already have a rational royalty policy out there. How does it compete against AV1? Performance should be better than AV1 with less complexity on the encode and decode side. And does it reduce complexity? Yeah, it does. That makes it the only software codec of the three MPEG codecs launched in the last year or so. Okay, how are we doing here? Talk faster. Okay, analyzing quality. We're going to look at rate distortion curves and BD rate functions, what they are, what they mean, and how they are used, how to produce them, issues we have with BD rate functions, and we're going to examine a better alternative. So what they are, BD rate statistics and rate distortion curves represent how one codec or one encoding set of encoding parameters compares to another. And the rate distortion curve is the visual element of it. And you can look at this and, this is always the data rate axis. This is always the quality axis. We see here VVENC, which is the Fraunhofer VVC encoder I tested. We're going to look at the end of this presentation. And I compared it to AOM-ENC, which is the Alliance for Open Media's AV1 encoder, and then we've got H.265 in green and H.264 in Tony purple down here. So we see that VVC gives us slightly higher quality at slightly lower bit rates than AV1, does much better than AVC, much better than HEVC, and even better than H.264. And the BD rate is the numerical component. So we can look at this and say, okay, we know which one is better, but what these numbers do is they say along these operating points, from here to here, VVC or VVENC can produce the same quality as AOM-ENC with a bit rate reduction of 5.78%, same quality as H.265 with a bit rate reduction of 28.56%, and the same quality as H.264 with a lower bit rate of 42%. And then green is good, pink is bad, and here you'd look at the H.264 line and say it takes 72% more bandwidth to produce the same quality as VVC with H.264. And the B and BD rate stands for Bjontegaard, and this quantifies the differences between the two curves. So here we have two curves. This is technology A, this is technology B, and the BD rate is a value for the difference throughout the entire curve. And what it measures is the quality, what it measures is the data rate saving for the same quality. So again, this is technology A, this is technology B. Technology B is higher, and it gives us the same quality at a lower bit rate. So this quality level is the BD rate function, and we see that technology B is saving us this amount from technology A. And then BD PSNR is the quality disparity for the same bit rate. So that's the difference between, both of these have the same bit rate. That's the difference in quality at this particular point. Now it says BD PSNR, but you can use Bjontegaard functions BD rate with any metric, whether it's subjective like MOS or whether it's objective like VMAF or SimPlus or any others. So how do you produce rate distortion curves and BD rate functions. Typically, you encode your test clip to at least 4 encoding points. So you might do data rates from 1 to 4 megabits per second. You might do 4 CRF values. Then you plug into an Excel scatter chart, and boom, there you go. And typically, when you're planning your study, you want to represent the typical operating range of the codec. So what we're seeing here is a range from 96 to 88, which is a little high because most people are going to ship their highest quality rung on the encoding ladder somewhere between 93 and 95. So obviously on the ideal range for rate distortion curves, it would be from say 95 down to 88's not terrible because you've got you need to incorporate that low for some of these technologies. So anyway, you don't want to see it all the way down in the 50 or 60 range because then you're measuring the quality at levels that nobody ships their video in. You want this to be the tightest range possible as it relates to the rung of the encoding ladder that relates to. So how do you compute BD rate functions? Read this article here. I'll save us all the discussion for this particular slide. But there's a free Excel macro you can download with the article. Makes it very simple, and the article, of course, describes everything you need. So what are my issues with BD rate computations? Number one, I've got the academic versus real world comparisons, which I find very irritating. And then the concept of actual profile usage. So here we have an academic and a real world comparison. This is a white paper written by these people. It's a fine white paper, really does a great job analyzing the quality of VVC. But they reached the conclusion that for tested versions, there was no significant difference between AV1 and HEVC. So there's that. MSU in their 2019 comparison found that AV1 is 22% more efficient than the best of the HEVC codecs and was 32% more efficient than H.265. So, two men say they're Jesus, one of them must be wrong. Not to show my age, but there's a big disagreement in terms of overall quality. And let's look at why that is. So the academics or the researchers are testing a reference codec, also called a test model. And that's a codec that provides access to all the features of the codec, even those that might not be implemented in the final version of the codec because the IP rights we looked at with VVC and EVC, or because they're just too slow. And it doesn't provide a relevant range of encoding controls like 2-pass VBR. So most of these analyses are QP based, which is what I had to do when I analyzed the Fraunhofer VVC encoder. So basically, the reference codec is not commercially usable, and with real-world codecs, it's commercially available, and it's within an encoder that gives you access to all the encoding modes that you need to ship real-world video. So the goal of an academic comparison is to benchmark theoretical codec performance, and that's a valid goal. The goal of a real-world comparison is to benchmark real-world encoding performance. The encoder is a reference or test model providing access to all codec features. And here you have real world encoders that have access to features that real producers are using. And the settings are typically, as I said, CQ based because most of the reference models don't include bitrate control because bitrate control isn't a codec thing, it's an encoder thing. And the settings for most real world comparisons are bitrate based, just like the videos you encode to distribute to your viewers. The test clips are a limited set of 10-second clips in YUV format, and they use the same clips over and over because that shows the progression of quality improvement. That's very valid, but the clips, very few producers encode YUV clips, and the range of clips encoded by most real-world producers is much greater. So in essence, academics test encoders no producer will ever use using settings no producer will ever use, with raw clips unlike most transcoded by most producers and videos that few consumers have or ever will watch. And they do that to gauge theoretical performance. Real-world trials test commercially available encoders using actual production settings with clips formatted like those they typically transcode, say 10 to 50 megabit per second for 1080p video. And they have multiple sources representing broad-based content. MSU uses dozens of Vimeo clips. In their comparison, Facebook has put out several great studies that are based on the clips that they're encoding in high volume. And Netflix uses their own library for a lot of the tests that they perform. And they do all that to gauge real-world performance because that's what they care about. They want to adopt a new codec if it delivers benefits within their use cases, not because of academic performance. So the bottom line for me is academic comparisons are valid tools for benchmarking theoretical codec performance, but if they use reference coders or test models, where they do CQ-based encoding as opposed to bitrate-based encoding, the results probably don't reflect real-world performance. The second issue I have with BD rate numbers is that actual savings depend on your usage. Actual savings from any new codec depend on which rungs of your encoding ladder are actually consumed by viewers. So these two ladders come from a Brightcove white paper that's totally irrelevant to the function I'm using them for, but they put together nice test data that makes some critical points. So if you have this encoding ladder and you changed from H.264 to HEVC, and you're delivering 94% of your video to people watching it on mobile devices with 3.29 megabit per second bandwidth, how much bit rate saving does the change to HEVC deliver in this case? And the answer is, drumroll, none, because the H.264 stream in the ladder might be a 3.29 megabit per second 720p stream. HEVC might be a 3.29 megabit per second 1080p stream. It's going to be higher quality, but you're not going to get any bitrate saving just based on how ABR works. I mean, if it's going to pull the 3.29 megabit per second clip if it's got that bandwidth. Now, if you look at a different ladder, and this is an IPTV ladder, where 100% of viewers are watching with very high bandwidth, which means they're pulling the highest quality stream in the encoding ladder, the savings are completely different. Basically, you get the total difference between the top rung. The example I used was HEVC as compared to H.264. So you harvest that entire benefit. So the results are very, very significant. When you look at BD rate numbers, they don't take any of this into account. They basically assume that every point in the operating curves that you defined have equal value, and that's never correct, which means they never really apply to a particular user. So what do we do different? What's the suggested approach? Create your ladder and insert usage statistics. So here we've got our bit rate. Here we've got our VMAF scores, which you should know for every rung on your encoding ladder. And this was pulled from Apple's HLS authoring specifications. These are kind of made up numbers, but they make the point. And then from this, you multiply the 2% times the bit rate, the 2% times the VMAP, you extend out on the spreadsheet, extend down, and now you've got your bit per second with H.264 and your weighted VMAP with H.264. And then you do the same thing with HEVC. So you've got same bit rates here, except the top three rungs are all going to be the same, all going to deliver the same quality, and you extend out to get weighted bit rate, you extend out to get weighted VMAP, and what we see is H.264 you'd be delivering about 5.2 megabits per second. With HEVC you'd be delivering around 3.6 megabits per second. So the real world savings is going to be 30.71, and the increase in overall score is going to be 2.1 weighted VMAP. So BD rate numbers are great for kind of generic results, but if you really want to understand how a new technology is going to benefit you, you need to look at your encoding ladder, and you need to look at your usage in those encoding ladder rungs. These results would be entirely different if usage was concentrated down here as opposed to concentrated down here. And if you're going to be comparing codecs, I recommend using subjective analyses, because as much as VMAP and Simplus continually improve, you always want to get a subjective viewer in there and some human eyes looking at your videos before you draw serious conclusions about respective quality. Okay. Oh boy. Okay. VVC trials. We tested Fraunhofer's VVC encoder called VVENC. Obviously, it's early days codec, and we compared it to FFmpeg running X.264, X.265, and AO Media's AOMENC standalone encoder. Encoding strings and other details are at streamingmedia.com. The article posted today. Here's the bit.ly URL. We tested 5 clips. This is just a very demanding test clip that's frequently used by standards bodies. This is a slow-moving clip from a movie. This is a gaming clip from the Twitch collection. This is a great sports test clip from Harmonic, and this is the animation. Just wanted to use a range of content. My encoding procedure was all QP based because VVENC doesn't support bitrate based encoding, or they recommended that I not use it. What I did was I created my targets looking at HEVC as kind of the base codec, and I found QP parameters with H.265 that delivered a high VMAF of around 36 and a low VMAF around 85. And then I picked 2 points in between that made sense. And then once I got the data rates of these rungs, I used QP values for the other codecs that delivered close to those data rates. And I did this for each, I did this uniquely for each of the 5 test clips. In terms of encoding time, I encoded 3 clips to identical target and I timed the encoding. H.264 encoded those clips in 4 minutes. H.265 was 10. The Alliance for Open Media encoder was 65 minutes, and then VVENC was 125 minutes. And this is the times real time, and this is times H.264. Now, we saw a few minutes ago that the goal for complexity was 10x HEVC. Here we see 10 minutes. Here we see 125 minutes, so it's about 12.5x. It's on track, nothing terrible. And it's about 2x the encoding complexity of AV1 with the encoding parameters that we use, which are in the streaming media article. In terms of quality, this is non-weighted average BD rate. We see that VVENC was 11% more efficient than AOM-ENC, AV1, was 39% more efficient than H.265. That was compared to a goal of 50%, and it's 58% more efficient than H.264. So that's pretty impressive in terms of decoding speed. And I tested encoding on this platform as well as decoding. I decoded on the notebook, converting to YUV, and then storing that YUV file on a RAM drive. So I had no heavy YUV encode that was included in the operation or YUV storage. Recorded CPU utilization and time, VVENC was 37 frames per second, AV1 was 116 frames per second, H.265 was 138, and H.264 was 277 frames per second. Now, my system has H.264 decode and HEVC decode on it. I don't think that the decoder used that in these tests. So what we're seeing is that VVENC has roughly a 3.7x complexity of HEVC, which, if HEVC is a hardware codec, then VVC is going to be a hardware codec. So I really enjoyed working with the Fraunhofer implementation. It's very polished and easy to use, though obviously it needs additional features like bitrate control. VVC quality is getting close to the targeted range, which is 50% more efficient than HEVC. Encode performance was on track, decode a little high, but it should come around. But we're going to need royalty data and a fixed royalty policy before we can gauge the trajectory for deployment of EVC. LCEVC testing. We tested a live transcoding use case, and we tested LCEVC with H.264 as a base layer as compared to H.264. And we did 2 specific use cases, e-games and esports, or e-games and sports, and we used 8 e-games clips, all 1080p 60, and 12 sports clips that were 1080p 30. And we deployed 2 tests, VMAF, which gives you a score from 0 to 100, and subjective testing using the double stimulus impairment scale, which delivers a MOS scoring from 1 to 10. Report's going to be published this week. In full disclosure, I consult with Vnova on testing and quality evaluations. I help produce most of the results that you're going to be seeing. So how did we create the LCEVC ladder? We started with a basic H.264 encoding ladder, and we tried to find a rung with LCEVC using H.264 as a base layer that matched the VMAF quality of that top H.264 layer. And typically that produced a bandwidth savings of around 25%. And then we computed lower bit rates, preserving the 1.5 to 2x differential between rungs that Apple's recommended since TN2224. For each rung, once we knew the data rate, we tested at multiple resolutions to figure out which resolution delivered the highest possible quality. And this is the convex hull analysis that Netflix debuted at this article here. And this produced 2 encoding ladders, one for e-games and one for sports. So these are the encoding ladders. And when we computed the savings, we measured the impact on the complete encoding ladder by using these usage stats, which came from several prominent potential licensees of the technology. So it is a full weighted average analysis, like I showed a few minutes ago. And we saw a 25% savings on the top rung, 23% savings real world, again, because it's weighted analysis, of 23% in terms of storage and egress to your distribution point. And we saw 19% lower actual real world bandwidth for this eGames ladder. Now, again, obviously, if we calculated 100% usage up here, this savings down here would be a lot closer to this. And sports ladder, same thing. You know, estimated usage was different. It was from a different source. And top rung savings was 25%. Average savings on this bitrate analysis was 22%. And the savings on the overall storage bitrate was 27%. What did this look like from a curve standpoint? This is where things got interesting. I mean, recall that we tried to choose the top encoding parameters to match the VMAP value of this at a lower bit rate. When we did the MOS scores, we saw that it produced much higher quality and much higher BD rate savings. So LCEVC in this configuration matched the quality of H.264 in this configuration at a 70% bit rate savings. Very, very impressive. And it increased MOS by 1.8 from down here to here, even though it reduced the bit rate by 25%. And then you get better quality throughout. And this is what VMAP looked like. You got a 25% saving here to here. Our target was a LCEVC clip that matched the quality, and obviously we came much closer to achieving that in the case of VMAP. 25% savings, top rung, better quality throughout. Here's the sports clips. And again, we see very significant BD rate savings that was unexpected. And we saw an increase in MOS despite the 25% reduction between here and here. And again, better quality throughout. VMAP, 25% savings in the top rung, better quality throughout. And you know, here's kind of the summary of the benefits. We saw a 19 and 22% reduction in bit rate, and this is real world weighted average bit rate. And we saw reasonable upticks in MOS and VMAP from, you know, this is the H.264 score, and this is the LCEVC with H.264 base layer score. So saving on bit rate, increased quality for better quality of experience. In terms of encoding requirements, this is an eGames example. Here are the test, you know, here's the machine that we used, here are the encoding profiles, and you know, we tried to come up with testing how efficient LCEVC was in producing an entire encoding ladder, which is obviously important for a transcoding application. And the key finding was that LCEVC H.264 as a base layer consumed 6% less CPU than H.264, even though it pushed out higher quality or a higher number of pixels. So here you've got two 1080p 60 rungs in the ladder, and here you've got one 1080p 60, and then you drop to 1080p or 720p 60, pushing out more pixels. So it is very efficient from an encoding perspective. And then on the decode side, we looked at both the voltage and the power consumption to try and assess the impact on battery life. And video 1 was H.264 2 megabits per second. Video 2 was LCEVC at 2 megabits per second. It's the same data rate. And video 3 was H.264 at 4 megabits per second to match LCEVC quality. And here's the testbed information. And what we see is that at 2 megabits per second, H.264 used slightly more voltage than LCEVC, about the same power. So it was slightly more power consumptive than LCEVC, even though this was hardware decode. And in terms of like quality, so this is the 4 megabit per second H.264 clip versus 2 megabits per second. The 4 megabit used more voltage and more power, so it's clearly much less efficient than LCEVC decode. So what's the summary? We've got, you know, solid weighted average bandwidth savings on a real world ladder, plus a noticeable uptake in overall quality. We've got efficient encoding and decoding. It's the only software codec of the three HEVC or MPEG codecs that can be deployed today. It's got a royalty structure that's in place, which should accelerate deployments, and it's currently shipping. So it's the only MPEG 2020 codec that's deployable today. And this is the final section. I know we're running short on time. This will take me about 3 minutes to go through. And you know, when do I project these codecs will be useful? And let me just point out, if you came late, you can download the handout in the GoToWebinar application on your right, and that gives you all this data, so you don't feel like you need to stay to hear it from me. So codec projections, let's start with reality, then we'll look at HEVC, VP9, AV1, LCEVC, and VVC-EVC. So this is from the BitMove in 2020 Video Developer Report. Here's the bit.ly URL. This came out within the last 2 months. And what we see is H.264, 91%, with 29% of respondents saying that we're going to be implementing H.264 in the next 12 months. Not quite sure how those numbers work, but that's what they said. HEVC is at 42%. So there's a lot of people currently deploying HEVC, and 47% of respondents said they were going to deploy HEVC in the next 12 months. VP9 has gotten some traction, but never as much as we thought it would, at 12%, with 18% saying that we're going to consider deployment in the next 12 months. AV1 is at 11%, just behind VP9, with higher adoption numbers for the next 12 months. How do I, where are the different technologies today and the different submarkets? Everything starts with a known royalty, and we typically, at this point, we pretty much know what's going to happen with HEVC. It's available in silicon now, it's in devices now, there's a market share worth chasing now, not in the browser now, it's probably never going to be in the browser. There are technologies available or products available for live contribution, live transcoding, software-based transcoding. Low latency, you don't see it used a lot, but it certainly could be, and it's the technology of choice for HDR. VP9, this is going to come down to what happens between Google and Sysvel, no telling when that's going to be. Silicon is available in some technologies. Playback is available in many non-Apple devices because it's a software codec. Market share is worth chasing now. It's in most of the AOM browsers now. Live contribution, there are a few options. I don't see VP9 playing in the live space. There's, 1 or 2 hardware options for transcoding. Live transcoding for software, I tried that for a client the last month and it was awful. I don't see that happening in any reasonable time frame. Low latency, it's available now for WebRTC, but not for HLS or Dash, any of those low latency HTTP technologies. And it's available for HLG. I'm not sure if it's going to make its way into Dolby Vision. AV1, known royalty, again, that's going to come down to Sysvel and the Alliance for Open Media. Silicon is coming. Device support is in some, primarily because of apps at this point. The market share is worth chasing because browser and software decode on devices. So it's in, as we saw, most of the AOM browsers at this point. Live contribution, not sure where's AV1's going to play in that market, but it should be available for single stream, I'm guessing in June 2020. Live transcoding and hardware, it's kind of a swag. Live transcoding software, again, tried software transcoding with AV1 and it was awful. And then low latency, it's available now for WebRTC. Cisco has a product, but I don't know how performing it is. It's certainly capable of HDR, but you don't see it mentioned in Dolby Vision specs yet. I'm sure it'll be out there. I'm saying June 2020, not saying it's going to be in Dolby Vision, but it will be in some of the other HDR technologies if you can't do it today. VVC, EVC, this is, these are the 2 big question marks. When are we going to have a known royalty? I'm being hopeful on VVC and predicting June 2021. EVC with their 2-year plan, if they push it out here, all the other adoption points get pushed out by 2 years as well. VVC gets interesting for hardware developers once they know what the royalty schedule looks like. Silicon will be available 1 year after hardware developers get working, which presumably won't be until they know the royalty. Device support a year later, and then market share worth chasing is just going to be pushed out there because you need a critical mass of targets who can play VVC videos. In browser, same stories we thought with HEVC, live contribution. These are just kind of swags as well, and it's not going to be relevant for HDR until it's available for playback on a lot of smart TVs and a lot of HDR capable platforms. LCEVC is pretty attractive right now, known royalty. I found it today that it is known. Don't see a lot of silicon, but you don't really need silicon with the product. It's available for device playback now because it is a software-based codec. Market share is worth chasing. You can get it in your browser now via player. It doesn't look like Vnova is going to be charging royalties on software playback, so you can do that. You should be able to do that royalty-free. It's available for live contribution now. VNova has had product in live contribution for many years at this point. I don't know if there's any live transcoding hardware available now. Should be available soon, but you don't really need it. The test that we performed to measure encoding CPU was real-time transcoding. Low latencies, these again are swags. Don't know when they'll appear, but they're not here today. They should be here in a reasonable time frame. And that's all I got. So any questions out there? See a couple of nice comments. I forgot that part where I was supposed to send myself questions or prepare questions so I can answer them myself. So the couple things that I want to note, the VNova report should be available from the VNova website and also from my website, Streaming Learning Center, probably by the end of the next week to be safe. The VVC article is available on Streaming Media Now as I picked up. Most of these materials are going to be put into lessons in the Streaming Learning Center training courses. And because you signed up for this, you're now on my mailing list and you'll be hearing about those courses in the future. Anyway, listen, I appreciate everybody who came. And I hope you felt the presentation was worthwhile. If you have any questions, you're welcome to email me. And everybody who attended this or signed up will get a free link to the on-demand version of this webinar. That's all I got. Stay healthy out there, and thanks for watching.